And we're back to education. We are live. We are live, and we are back. And we are. This is going to be pretty much it. Earlier, we have been still trying to clean up bills that we have, so that we can focus our attention totally on 454. And today we had all the V's, Vermont associations, principals, school business managers, superintendents, because I'm all in at the beginning and want to give everybody a chance to comment before we dug our heels way in on this bill. We've taken some walkthroughs, but we haven't really started tearing it apart. So I'm going to start with Jay Nichols, who's on Zoom. And Jay, I think you know the routine. Just identify yourself and who you represent.
All right, thank you, Senator. Coming to you live from a Toyota RAV4 in the South Burlington parking lot. So hopefully you can hear me okay. So for the record, Jay Nichols, Executive Director of the Vermont Principals Association. I am also an appointee on the Commission for the Future of Public Education. I've been a principal in both supervisory school districts and supervisory unions, and I've been a superintendent in both supervisory unions and in supervisory districts. My comments for this committee are around education spending and education finance, as I believe these issues are more germane for the Committee on Finance. My comments are related directly to H 454 as it was passed in the House and any related considerations. Obviously, the aspect of this bill that is probably the most on people's mind is the foundation formula, or I guess they're calling it the educational opportunity payment. The foundation formula has many advantages, especially in terms of making it clear to school districts what they will have for spending dependent on the makeup of their student population. However, it's important to make 2 points very clear. First, foundation formulas typically do not cut education spending in the short term. The only way to do that is to cut staff and programs for kids. That is why almost all states who begin a foundation formula start where they are at in terms of education spending and actually infuse cash into the system to help with the transition. This ensures that schools, programs, and ultimately children don't get hurt during the implementation process. Secondly, some states put in a foundation formula, but the General Assembly doesn't appropriately fund the new system over time. A great example of that's Alaska. This leads to an increased gap between the haves and the have-nots. So it's important to make sure an appropriate inflationary index is prescribed in law. And I know this is something the House Ways and Means Committee looked at very seriously, and I hope you will do the same. We, the VPA's executive board, supported H54 in large part. Although there are areas of the bill that we would not support on their own, we think looking at the bill with a comprehensive and student-centered view, we feel is the best proposal or concept we have seen or heard about thus far. Here are some of the reasons we support the financial approach laid out in 454. This plan puts in a foundation formula that will have an inflation index, and the formula will be reviewed regularly to ensure it is meeting the educational spending level necessary to provide for a high quality education system, which we all want in Vermont. The plan provides the same amount of funding based on student enrollment for independent and public schools. This is especially important at the high school level, as small tuitioning towns will no longer have to automatically cut elementary programming to pay tuition rates that they have no say over. Class size minimum standards will become law with appropriate exceptions and the possibility for waivers as necessary. We think this is critically important because any funding system that looks to bend the cost curve without hurting children has to acknowledge that the fundamental cost driver we are dealing with that school districts have some control over is staff to student and teacher to student ratios. This plan is gradual and allows systems to make changes as they right size to a future state that will ultimately lead to less school districts and many places larger schools. The plan also addresses the importance of construction needs for school facilities in cases in which school districts need to merge schools and simply don't have the space or building infrastructure to do so without state funding support. And finally, the plan provides support for small schools and sparse school districts that are small because of necessity, not small because of choice. Given that we have a statewide education taxing and spending system, and that it is the General Assembly and all taxpayers' responsibility to fund education, it's important to make sure that we are not inadvertently encouraging through financial support systems that choose to be small, given that in general, the smaller school district, the less opportunities for students, at least until we get to the scale size of around 4,000 students. And below, I've embedded a simple little chart that I think is real simple for people to understand, describes the main pros and cons of foundation systems. And Senator Cummings, that's all I have for you. I'm willing to come back in any time, talk about details. That's a brief overview from my perspective on education funding piece, and I'm more than willing to answer any questions as best I can.
Okay, committee, have questions? I'm not seeing any right now, but as we start digging into this, I'm sure we'll have more, and we'll invite you to listen in and zoom in.
I guess I'd ask one to you,
Who's got one?
Mr. Nichols. The conversation has come up regarding the the contemplated allowable 10% above the foundation. And some notions have raised whether or not we should allow that at all. I'm curious, do you have any thoughts on, as we're contemplating a foundation formula, if school districts should be able to spend above what the state deems an adequate amount?
I think that we're going to have to start there, Senator Chittenden, depending on how big the sizes are because of the economy of scale piece. Right now, I'm a little worried. I hear from superintendents and principals in school districts that are already at scale that are making some pretty big cuts. Not to mention any names, but I'm pretty close to where some of these are occurring right now. And they're really worried about the number of people they've had to cut already. And so we need to model it out and take a look at it. And if we see that, geez, we've got a bunch of these places that are already at scale, we want to be really careful about making them stay below a certain level if it's going to mean really making some significant cuts to kids. And I think the $10,000, maybe it's the $64,000 question in the room is around teacher pay and compensation. And in some of the places that are at scale, we pay teachers quite a bit more. And I think that in a lot of other places, we pay teachers a lot less than what they probably should get. So as a result of that, we might be cutting off our nose to spite our face here. We need to be real careful that we don't do any damage as we enter this new system. So I would say, and I'll say this over and over again, I don't see us saving a lot of money in the short term, but I do think we can bend the spending curve in the long term by having better scale and size of districts and size of classrooms and in school, actual school sizes over time. But in duck that, I tried to answer that as appropriately as I could.
Okay. Any other questions for Jay? Okay, thank you.
All right, I'll be listening. Thank you all very much.
Okay, good. Okay, Jeff Bannon is also. Oh, he's right there. Okay, I knew I saw you in that direction.
Good afternoon, Jeff Bannon, Executive Director of Vermont NEA. Thank you very much for having me give some preliminary thoughts about the House passed H454. Before I start, though, I'd like to talk a little bit about how Vermont's publicly funded schools are doing. In a word, Vermont's local public schools and the educators who work in them are doing great things. In fact, despite the rhetoric, they are more than making grade. Our public schools are a place where all students from all walks of life can learn and thrive, and they do learn and thrive. Vermont should be proud of its investment in its children, as Vermont is at the top in several measures of success. On the nation's report card, Vermont is top 3 in 8th grade literacy. Vermont compares favorably to larger and wealthier neighboring states, such as Massachusetts and New York. In other words, we punch above our weight. And we have some of the best and brightest graduates in the world. Nace Mitchell from Mount Abe, Shauna Togue from Harwood, who between them have won 10 Tony Awards, and Victor Ambrose from Woodstock, who won the 2024 Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine. And of course, how many of us have heard of Grace Potter? She too is a proud product of our local public schools, as are countless teachers, plumbers, electricians, doctors, and even politicians, including many of you and the governor. All this success comes from a system that funds more than just academics. The education fund pays for services that most states do not. For example, social and emotional student health, And we are seen as the most inclusive state in the country when it comes to education, educating students with disabilities. In short, we have much to be proud of when it comes to Vermont's publicly funded school system. Vermonters who work in our schools, classroom teachers, special educators, schools counselors, librarians, bus drivers, paraeducators, custodians, food service workers, psychologists, occupational therapists, among others, have worked through a pandemic, through a decades-long nationwide educator workforce shortage that results in staff vacancies in all buildings that are in need of significant repair as the buildings need repair. But they are showing up every day to support our youngest citizens, their students, meet their needs, learn, and realize their potential. Sometimes this includes supporting them through major milestones, and more often it is being a stable, supportive, and caring adult in their lives. Make no mistake, in a relatively poor rural state, our educators and students and our public education system is something to be proud of and something we should be preserved and strengthened. Vermonters routinely vote to increase taxes on themselves to pay for our local publicly funded schools, and we should be cognizant of that deep investment local communities have made in their schools. Additionally, Vermont school boards and administrators are ever vigilant when it comes to using limited resources wisely. The most recent town meeting day budgets, for example, reduced staffing by almost 400 educators. If this type of mass layoff, Vermont workers getting pink slips would have happened in any other employment sector, it would have been headline news. This was done intentionally, transparently, surgically, and locally, which is to say communities throughout Vermont reduce staff to control costs, but hopefully not reduce academic opportunities for students. Well, this is the second year of staff reductions and is a worrisome trend. It was done with the approval of local voters, not done to local school communities by the state. And layer on top of this, the state of schools is the tumultuous nature of events happening at the Federal Department of Education. Indeed, the chaotic and unknown nature of the events in DC has educators, administrators, and school boards walking on eggshells, anxious about doing anything further to upset the system. Just last week, for example, schools were threatened with losing federal funds for simply complying with Act 1 from 2019. That was passed and signed into law, calling all Vermont schools to teach an honest curriculum about our history and to do it in a racially sensitive manner. It is with this backdrop that Vermont ADA reviewed the bill, H454, and through the lens of doing no harm to the educational system. Shaking the system snow globe even more after surviving the pandemic, including the loss of federal pandemic recovery funds and the new student weights that are all still becoming better known, could do affirmative harm to our students and the education they receive. This is not to say any change is ill-advised, but change for the sake of change is not helpful. H454 is a timeline for implementation that, while aggressive, is realistic in addressing the current challenges facing our education system. So we like the timeline, H454. The bill protects educators' rights to collectively bargain, and those folks are feeling under attack by the culture wars and educator shortage, which is real and extremely troubling now and well into the future, which is to say that educator shortage has been around for some time, and there's no end in sight that I've seen. There is no pipeline of educators stepping forward to fill the new vacancies, notwithstanding the 400 layoffs, and the bill does nothing to exacerbate the educator shortage. That's a good thing. We do have some concerns with the bill. The class size section is concerning because we know there is no perfect size, and in fact, we know that this is one of the characteristics that makes our schools special and is often a goal for other states. Make no mistake, micro classes are not good, but setting a class size number in statute may have unintended consequences for students. Additionally, it may be used to close small rural schools without community buy-in. And while the exemptions may allow some schools that cannot ever meet the goals of the bill to remain, it is a concern that, again, there could be unintended consequences. Furthermore, the intent language to achieve school size targets needs to include school construction funding to support for those goals to ever be achieved. If you don't have school construction funding, we don't think you can ever realize the goals of that section. It's just not going to happen. The financing aspects of the bill are again mixed. The cost factor foundation formula does achieve equity in the moment and reflects the real costs of educating economic kids, But as with any formula, the inflator must be realistic and have teeth in case it is cast aside for economic expediency. Further, we have concerns with a political appointee adjusting the formula amount, even with the guardrails that are in place in the bill, as is found in section 34 of the bill. For example, there is no appeal process if the school district believes the inflator isn't what it should be. And even if a district or any interested party believe the amount was not accurate, the language gives the secretary the authority to set the inflation rate, and the court likely would give the language by the Secretary of Education its full intended meaning. Moreover, relying on the U.S. Department of Commerce for data right now more than ever is a mistake. This doesn't in section 34, subsection 16. On the page, sorry. Indeed, Professor Colby suggested using a labor market inflation tool and not a generic inflation device. We additionally suggest adding a healthcare inflator aspect to section 34 so as to recognize what we all know to be the single largest cost driver, the cost of healthcare. Vermont NEA has been suggesting for some time that the state move to a reference-based pricing structure for hospitals that have more than 200 beds, as has been successfully implemented in other states. That alone would reduce ed spending by upwards of $30 million next year. Finally, misspelled that in my written submission, I apologize. Because the finance part, your committee has the yield bill, rather than doing a universal rate buy down, it should be used to use a portion of the reserve monies to reduce property taxes in a targeted way for working class Vermonters, but leave as is the current tax on the wealthiest among us. This would allow some Vermonters to see their tax bill lower, while those Vermonters with means to pay what would otherwise be their normal increase. A better approach altogether would be to adopt an income-based education tax for all Vermonters. Vermont NEA has long advocated for a three-step approach to lowering and then eliminating property taxes for Vermont residents. First, adjust the income sensitivity thresholds to account for inflation. This has not been ever done. Second, examine what is now coming out of the education fund that was not previously. And finally, move to income-based education for all Vermont residents, which is a fair and more understandable taxing system. Thank you for the opportunity to address some of the concerns with H454. More importantly, thank you for recognizing the excellent work of our educators and students and working in Vermont's locally publicly funded schools. When all is said and done, publicly funded schools are Vermont's most important resource, a resource our kids depend on and deserve on their journey to becoming happy, healthy, and productive adults. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, Jeff, for your testimony. The section 34 is on the bottom, starts on the bottom of page 67 of the bill. Or no, it starts on page 66, but I think the section you're talking about with the inflation is on the bottom of 67, paragraph 16. So my question to you is it says that the secretary shall adjust it. So it's not like the secretary is an option. They're required by law to adjust it by inflation. So I'm wondering, does that not satisfy that they would have to do it? And
I'm just nervous. I mean, I think my concerns flows from using the national federal Department of Commerce and then
NEPA or NIPA or whatever it's called. That's on the top of page 68. I think there's a section in the bill that also is that somebody has to come back with recommendations about what inflator we have to use, and this is maybe just a placeholder.
perhaps.
But I do hear you. We have to get the right inflator. So I'm wondering. So thank you for that.
Just a quick response on that.
Yeah.
It's not. There are 34. I think there's other states that use foundation formula of some sort or another. I did speak with some colleagues in my country, and they all said, "Yeah, it can be good." Usually starts off good and then whittles over time and deprives schools of the necessary resources. So all of them said you have to have an inflator that actually has meaning. It's realistic, right? Having just an inflator that never meets the actual true cost of educating kids is not helpful.
Yeah.
It doesn't include anything for healthcare, for example. And that's a big driver, and the cost of healthcare is far outpaces any other inflation measure.
Yeah, and I think
and in the likes of the federal right now, it's just
I understand anything that they're doing is challenging right now. But I think that Professor Colby suggested an index that is a labor-based index, which would get to the healthcare costs because the cost of labor includes the cost of healthcare.
I didn't hear it that way, but if it does include labor and healthcare included there.
I can continue
Yeah.
on that, but my other question for you is the class size, your concerns about the class size, and the school size language that's in the bill. I share some of those concerns as somebody who represents a lot of really tiny schools. And one of my schools, the school board, this is ACSD, just implemented a 10 ratio for class size minimums of an average of 10 kids. And that's lower than what's in the bill right now. I think it's 12 for kindergarten,
12 for
15 for 1 through 4. Yeah, so it's much lower than, and that they just did 10 for, I think, maybe all grades.
Yes.
And that's been effective in helping them make some tough decisions about our tiniest schools, but has also, I think, been helpful to allow some of our reasonably small schools to stay. So I'm wondering if you or NEA have a suggestion about class sizes from the perspective of educators, because I do know that classes that are too small are problematic for teachers too. So where do you all find the sort of right fit?
I think a lot, I mean, I would say there's no right fit. I think I say that there's, no one class size is appropriate across the board. And some communities just will never be able to achieve that. And we know that. So there are exemptions to that.
Right, the small by necessity kind of thing.
Correct.
Yeah.
And I don't think that I can sit here if you're a teacher who's, the teachers in South Carolina, have talked to them. Some of them have rather large classes, over 30 in some cases. That's a challenge for them in a lot of ways. And then you can go to the Northeast Kingdom or maybe Addison County or something and see a much different number. And somewhere what works locally, what they can afford, what they think they can teach, is probably the right number. I don't have a magic crystal ball to say.
You guys don't have a recommendation?
Right. And I would say that if you'll hear some discussions about, research says that they should be larger or this or that. I think the truth is it's mixed. There's a lot of research both in America and Europe on class size, and it varies.
Yeah, I mean, it also varies by demographics, and I've read a lot of that research, but I think that the class size part of the bill is part of the mechanism for cost controls. And so I wouldn't want to get rid of it entirely, because I think it's something that we can point to say, this is a way that we can manage costs better. But I also am very concerned about the rural schools in my district and putting a bunch of them out of business, and really harming some of those communities. So I feel like we need to find a balance between those two things. And that's why I'm looking for, recommendations from not just you, but everybody.
Yeah,
and I'm wondering what your position is.
I don't have a specific number.
Okay.
I know nothing from NEA does. So what I would say is the underbelly truth is we have a demographic problem in the state. There's more than just education. And so we, as a state, I think need to get serious about how we attract families of all sorts.
Sure, absolutely. But the bill has a mechanism that I think, a lot of people are trying to think about the bill as to how it can control cost. That is one of the ways it can. And I think that's fair in a lot of ways, but how can we do it in a way that we don't destroy all of the rural schools in our state? And I'm given that I represent so many rural schools, I'm trying to find what's the right balance.
Yeah, and I think the bill does. Again, the timeline I think is appropriate. Gives people time to achieve that scale or that class size as well. There's an appeal process, which I think is good.
Mhm.
There are exemptions, and then it's a 2-year kind of look. So there are ways to address it. And again, I don't know what the exact number, I think it's different in Addison County than Essex County, or Franklin County or something like that. It varies all over the state. Even, Franklin County, they're different, much closer to Burlington might look very different than, say, more northern reaches of Franklin County, for example.
Yeah, I don't think we can do a county by county.
No,
So-
no, but I just, I'm thinking of that term.
Yeah.
In this room.
Thanks.
Any other questions? Not seeing any, thank you.
Thank you all.
We'll be talking some more with
So,
everybody.
Morale.
Okay, Chelsea Myers.
Did you submit, is yours,
Yes,
you have,
I go with it.
and Heather Bushy and I are gonna do joint this.
Okay.
All right? Hi, everyone. Chelsea Myers, Executive Director of Vermont Superintendent's Association.
And Heather Bushy, I am the president of the Vermont Association of School Business Officials.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify. We are submitting the testimony on behalf of the Vermont Superintendent's Association and Vermont Association of School Business Officials, whose members are committed to serving Vermont public schools across the state. We appreciate the General Assembly's leadership in developing this thoughtful and ambitious legislation to transform Vermont's education system. Aligning comprehensive consideration for scale with fiscal policy. Education policy that aims to achieve scale must do so at all levels of the system. Adjusting one element without addressing others will not be sufficient and may have unintended consequences. This work must be done thoughtfully and with strong support for communities, balancing the need to expand student opportunities, improve operational efficiencies, and preserve democratic input is essential. As we have stated previously, while district scale is one part of the equation, it will not achieve the level of cost containment sought by the administration or this body. The cost of leveling up contracts remains an unknown factor in this process. Pay parity is a laudable goal, but we urge the committee to explore just how many resources will be needed to move from our current system to new district structures. Superintendent Ryan Harity presented the following example from his region in recent testimony. If a new district was created around the Green Mountain Tech Center, it would be composed of Lamoille North, Lamoille South, and Orleans South. Most likely this would result, and this is quoted exactly from his testimony, this would result in the leveling up of contracts to be equal to the highest paying salary schedule. The chart included in this testimony indicated that it would be an additional cost of $2.7 million for teacher contracts only within that region. Achieving standards of scale will require significant capital investment, especially in areas where current infrastructure is inadequate. We strongly emphasize the need for robust state aid for school construction to support local districts in implementing these changes. Without such investment, districts may face insurmountable challenges in complying with the class size and school size standards envisioned in this bill. Moreover, the fiscal policy included in this bill must align with the broader education policy goals around scale. One of the options outlined by Dr. Colby's memo offers this approach, and I quote, "An alternative to a variable base could be to establish a categorical grant program that provides a fixed per student grant to small schools with fewer than 100 students at a rate of $3,157. Schools in sparsely populated areas with fewer than 55 persons per square mile would have a base of 1,954, a categorical grant per student, or that are both small and sparse at 5,000. Grants could be conditioned on schools meeting criteria for geographic constraints that prevent them from operating at scale. Pupil weights would not be applied to the additional aid a school receives through a grant program." H 454 in its current form acknowledges these recommendations through small school grants, which will be linked to the new state board rules on geographic necessity. However, it introduces the category of sparse school districts. Why does this language deviate from the school level sparsity model Dr. Colby recommends? In both current and future districts, all students would receive per pupil sparsity grants, regardless of whether their school is actually located in a sparsely populated area. Does that approach align with the core policy goals outlined in H 454? And so as an example, if you had a larger district and you had multiple population centers within that, but a huge geographic expanse, you would then be giving every student in that district a sparsity grant. And we're very curious as to why that decision is made in policy. VFA and, Heather, your turn.
That's okay. On the topic of statewide cohesion, VSA and VASBO fully endorse the bill's direction toward greater statewide cohesion in several operational domains. A unified statewide school calendar will streamline planning and coordination across regions. And in fact, some regions already work to try and do that within smaller regions. A cohesive school finance system and statewide student information system is vital to data consistency, transparency, and accountability. And statewide graduation requirements will support consistent educational opportunities for students across the state. In addition, all of these steps toward greater cohesion will support greater access to career and technical education.
VSA and VASBO support a shift to a funding formula that promotes greater equity across the education system. Establishing a predictable per pupil based funding level can help stabilize local budgeting and enhance transparency. However, we urge the committee to reconsider one key element of the current proposal: the use of disability categories as cost indicators for pupil weighting. Weighting students based on disability categories does not align with the intent or best practices outlined in Act 173. Reforms Vermont has worked hard to try to implement over the past several years. Educational needs within each disability category can vary widely, and assigning weights based on category rather than actual service needs risks distorting funding and creating unintended inequities. In times of fiscal pressure, this approach may also inadvertently incentivize over-identification, moving us further from evidence-based practices for supporting students with learning differences. We encourage the committee to explore alternative approaches, and if you give us a little bit more time to gather some experts in the field, we'd be happy to come back with more specific recommendations.
Would love.
We just haven't gotten that far. People on break this week. It was a lot.
Yes.
So I'm happy to convene some folks out here to
That would be helpful.
dive deeper into that. Go ahead, Heather.
On the topic of supplemental spending, which came up a little bit ago, it's difficult to fully assess the impact of supplemental spending without a clear understanding of the new district configurations and the composition of newly formed school boards. It's also unclear why one district might approve additional spending while another might reject it. What are the implications of this variability for educational equity? If supplemental spending is ultimately adopted, we strongly recommend maintaining the school construction fund and linking it to the revenue generated through this mechanism.
Tax implications. We've heard from the administration and lawmakers that voters have asked for tax relief. However, there has been little discussion about what these reforms will actually mean in terms of tax relief for the average Vermonter. In fact, under a foundation formula, either one proposed, communities that currently benefit from lower tax burdens due to historically lower spending may see their tax rate increase under the proposals presented so far. While simplifying our education tax system is a worthwhile goal, it's unclear how taxpayers, particularly in communities that will receive more per pupil funding and share a tax rate across a broader geographic area, will experience any meaningful relief. We urge the committee to carefully consider both the short and long-term impacts of H454 by modeling the impact on taxpayers across the state.
Both of our associations have testified extensively on the need to address the root cost drivers in the education system. And you've heard others talk about the healthcare costs in particular. While H454 and other legislation introduced this session have begun to tackle some of these issues, such as staffing levels, the broader systemic challenges driving education costs in Vermont remain largely unaddressed. We will continue to revisit these conversations year after year unless we confront the full picture. The lack of affordable housing, the rising cost of healthcare that consumes an increasing share of education budgets, the growing responsibilities schools carry in providing mental health services, and the economic reality that without more livable wage jobs, Vermont will continue to face an aging population and a shrinking tax base.
The change outlined in H454 will take tremendous support and coordination from the state. VSA and VASBO commend the thoughtfulness and detail with H454. We support the direction of the bill and stand ready to work collaboratively with the legislature, agency of education, and our educational partners to realize its goals. Thank you.
Thank you. Committee, any questions? Wanda Harding.
Thank you. Thank you, Chelsea. Thank you for offering to get some special education because I think that's such a huge change. I want to make sure we understand the implications, not just financially, but in classroom if there are any. And then I have the same question for you that I was asking Jeff about the class size.
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure that the class size numbers in Bill came actually from your suggestion. Or not you personally, but your group's suggestion. And I'm wondering, I am concerned about the impact of that on our smallest rural schools and wondered sort of how you came to that, or if you have any second thoughts.
sure. I need to be fully clear and transparent that we have a process that does not include 100% agreement on everything all the time. So
Yeah.
you will find superintendents that do not agree with some of the recommendations. I just want to be really transparent about that. The way that we came up with those is I did a little bit of a tutorial on the class size research, which in general is not super applicable to Vermont because the sizes are not within the range that we currently operate at. And then at a all members meeting, which you all join us for, they got into groups and kind of hashed it out. And so it's not necessarily based on research because the research doesn't really align with how they operate in Vermont. So that's where those recommendations come from. In terms of the current bill, H 454, I think there are a lot of mechanisms in there that allow for exceptions and honor our rural communities, like, for example, the rulemaking on geographic necessity, the built-in tie to the education quality standards, right? That mechanism that also kind of fuses with education quality and accountability. So I think that the mechanisms in there are speak to some of the concerns about rurality. It's not our intent, I think, as I said in this committee before, to want schools that are in the Northeast Kingdom with no other option around to close. Like, that wouldn't make sense at all. And to your question, do we rethink, or would we rethink that? I would have to go back to my board and members on what my hunch is, and I'm just gonna go out on a limb here, is that there would be a preference to keep it by the majority. And if you were to, and if there were decisions made in this body to keep the framework and lower the minimum, then to remove it altogether. Does that make sense? So that rather than removing all the class size minimum language, to reconsider what those numbers are actually in the bill.
They would rather have a reconsideration of the number than removing.
That's my hunch. I would have to go back to my board and.
That's where I'm at too.
So-
And what in the school size, the 450, I know that's just intent language, but that is also freaking some people out. And that's like way higher than most of our schools.
Yeah,
The largest elementary school in my district, the Middlebury Elementary School, is not 450.
that doesn't apply to or to elementary schools in H 450.
Well, our middle school is not either.
I
So
think
it's
that there is a need to get
way out
very
of range.
clear too, like, there's a lot of places where why would we include middle and upper school when we have just solo high schools? Like, I think taking a closer look at that language is worthwhile. What I would say is if you're looking at new builds, you should be looking at building schools that are not at scale. And so if that intent language is tied to construction in which we are building schools at scale rather than rebuilding schools not at scale,
Yeah, that makes
would
sense
be
to
the ideal.
sort of forward looking
I think
rather
so.
than current looking. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
Reading the third paragraph of your testimony, and I really appreciate this one statement that I think is part of a conversation that's been happening, which is where you say we need to preserve democratic input, which is essential. So I am of the opinion that supplemental district spending is a necessity that I would not really support a path where the state of Vermont and the legislators around here dictate spending amounts that in the future legislature, if economic times are extremely difficult and rough, they basically lower it to a point where it would translate to no local control or say over possibilities of retaining some of their programs. Would you elaborate on that point? And could you imagine a scenario where we would not allow a local district to have any form of supplemental district spending approved by their voters?
Yeah, I think in this context, we were referring more to like if you get to really big district sizes, for example, you really have not a lot of depth. It's like how distance is the district size from local control rather than specific about the spending decisions. Our association doesn't have a position on the supplemental spending as of this moment. I don't know if VASBO does though.
No, VASBO does not either. I think, you know, there's just not enough information yet to understand the full impact of that supplemental spending, and how it will be used, and, you know, also wanting to ensure that we still keep educational equity while also allowing that supplemental spending. So, we do not have a current position.
Can I ask one follow-up? And similar to the conversation we just had about district size, I believe you testified earlier about 3,800 as like the.
So I have testified a number of times about the district scale research. And I mean, I think bottom line is that the working group is better situated than just arbitrarily drawing lines, because there's so many factors that go into it. But the research would suggest that between 2,000 and 4,000, particularly setting a minimum of 4,000 is for our rural communities would likely, it feels pretty big for like somewhere like the Kingdom, which would increase the geographic span hugely and would require potentially more transportation. You'd have central office, like instructional leaders never being able to be in the buildings because of the geographic span. So that 4,000 minimum doesn't feel quite right for some of our rural communities. Whether that is a simple language change from minimum to average, I'm not really sure. I would personally leave it up to the working group.
Okay. Thank you. That's helpful because that was another number that was concerning.
I mean, I think you cover it by saying research based, right?
Yeah, but the research is so variable and not based on Vermont that,
Right.
you know, what works in Kansas may not work here or where the research is done.
I think I'm more advocating like that there could be a fear that if you don't put a number in, that we would come back with recommendations that don't actually move us to greater district scale. So like balancing data and research with an expectation that we're not going to stay at 119. And that be realized without setting the minimum at 4,000. Because in Chittenden County, right, 4,000 could be potentially bigger, but in other areas, 4,000 would cover such a big geographic area that I don't know that it would actually increase efficiencies or opportunities for students.
Other questions? Thank you.
Afternoon, everybody. My name is Flora Diaz-Smith. I'm the president of Vermont School Boards Association, and I appreciate the chance to speak with you today. I'm here to talk about H 454 as passed by the House. The decision we make or choose not to make will have lasting consequences for public education in Vermont and for the long-term viability of our communities. As we shape the future of education together, we're also shaping the future of democracy in our state. It is important to remember that school board members across Vermont bring a wide variety or range of perspectives to the table. The SBA respects the diversity of thought, and we encourage that each of you to actively reach out to your board members, like you were saying, you were reaching out to the citizens in your regions, hear directly from those impacted will help ensure that the final outcome of H 454 is aligned with the values and goals of our communities. We appreciate the time and effort that has been taken to respond to the administration proposal and subsequently have this H 454, which has undergone significant revisions as a result of the months of testimony and our conversation. In its current iteration, it is evident that legislators have worked to incorporate feedback and legitimate concerns from different communities. The bill communicates a desire to take a measured approach to ensure that decisions about district scale are informed by public input, data, research, and geography, and to reflect a genuine understanding of the challenges our educators and school leaders face every day. Our hope is that as you continue this work, you keep in mind the importance of realistic and compassionate timelines for implementation and support, that you remain open to incremental change to ensure the consistency and continuity for students' learning, and to maintain a community-centered approach honoring local voices informed by data and research, and understanding the myriad dependencies and the impact of specific changes to the system as a whole. This bill is also about equity and sustainability. It lays the foundation for a fairer funding system with the base education amount guided by the work of Dr. Pammy Colby, and additional resources for students with greater needs and furthest removed from opportunity. Regular reviews will keep the formula responsive and relevant over time. H 454 promotes a better coordination across our state, aligning calendars, data systems, graduation requirements, and access to career and technical education so that every student, no matter where they live, has a clearer and more equitable path forward. Most importantly, it reopens the door to long overdue school funding construction. Okay, I have to be Most importantly, it reopens the door to long overdue construction, as I was saying. Here's some constructive input on the changes to improve the bill. You have a longer version in the testimony there. I'm gonna try to summarize that. There's gonna be some things here that you might think are not related to finance, but we are big believers that without a vision, can't really do finance. And without understanding that they are both connected. So in section 1, the school district boundaries subcommittee composition, right now, there's only a possibility of one retired school board member on the 9-person boundaries subcommittee. Even that school boards are the local legislative body for education, that isn't enough. We strongly recommend that at least 2 former or retired school board members have guaranteed seats. Also, we believe appointments should not be overly political. One solution is let the commission recommend members to reduce the bias and broaden that expertise. These decisions are too important for decision choices. And because the subcommittee and the school district boarding ward task force are doing closely linked work, consider overlapping their membership or even combining them. This will help ensure the process is smooth, aligned, and informed by the people who know how school governance works in Vermont. On section 1, 2, the school district boundary subcommittee duties, the current draft says new districts should ideally have about 4,000 students. We urge you to remove that number and instead require the district size be based on solid research. There's no magic enrollment number that guarantees quality or cost efficiency, especially not in a rural state like Vermont. Research and practice will show that leadership, context, and smart use of resources matter more. Let's keep the focus on what actually helps students succeed. In section 2A, school district voting ward task force. This group will recommend the number of school board members per district and how voting wards should be drawn. That is core to democratic representation and how.
Can you slow down a little bit? Sure. And what page are you on?
I'm in section 2A. So you should see, but it's
Okay,
really,
yeah.
you have it there.
Yeah, okay.
And if you see the testimony that we provided, it's a little longer and shows some of that language too.
Okay.
So in that section, in the school district boarding ward task force, this group will recommend the number of school board members per district and how voting wards will be drawn. That board to democratic representation, how well school boards reflect and engage with their communities, right? I think we all agree with that is core to that. We recommend adding at least one more school board member to this task force. School boards are the closest to the people, and the structure of those boards shape how well they serve community. And the community involvement in education is directly linked to better student outcomes. And you guys were just talking about that. Is that good? Move on. Okay, so if you look at section, I'm going to combine section 4 and 7, so class size waivers and school size. Okay, the minimum class size and school sizes must be set carefully. If the goal is better education, not just cost savings, we need to understand what the research says and take into account the unique geography and demographics of our state. We're also concerned about the timing. 7 different groups are working on overlapping issues at the same time under this bill. So many of the reports are due at once. So for example, if by December 1st, most of these reports would be due December 1st, 2025, which makes coordination difficult and we risk missing important insights. So in that section, if you are on that section right now, you can see that there's a lot of reports that are due. So let's take a step back and make sure that the standards for small by necessity, which you guys were just talking about, that schools, that is not rushed. So this decision should be based on full information, including input from the commission, the subcommittee, the agency of education, and the communities affected. Rural students still have a constitutional right to education. We need thoughtful, well-supported systems to protect that right. Okay, to move on. Section 6, rulemaking and standards. The State Board of Education plays a big role in implementing H 454, including the class size minimums and degradation standards. We support restructuring the State Board to reduce political influence and ensure broader, better representation. Local school board members should have a voice here. And the board needs the resources to do its job well, whether through increased budget support or collaboration with the Agency of Education. Moving all the way to section 16. In construction, rulemaking, the Agency of Education has significant responsibilities under this bill. Before transferring rulemaking for school construction from the State Board to the Agency of Education, we urge you to ensure that the agency has the staffing and the capacity to handle this work. Section 23, the State Board of Education membership. You have heard from us before on this, but the VSBA task force mentioned it has recommended restructuring the State Board to ensure that it can act in a non-political capacity. We appreciate that H 454 takes a step in that direction, expanding the appointment structure so that the governor does not have sole authority for appointing members. Additionally, the State Board makeup should more proportionally represent local school board members from districts that operate a public school and should have adequate resources to conduct its work. Good? Okay. So now the very end, data modeling and cost drivers. Finally, so that is not in there, but so finally, we want to stress how essential it is to have clear data and modeling to understand how the proposed foundation formula will impact school districts over time. Without that information, we cannot fully assess any proposal. So we're not prepared to, give you more on that. We appreciate that the bill focuses on adequate funding. I want to highlight the need for a formula that reflects the actual cost of health benefits for school employees and the cost that constitutes the rise every year, right? So right now, healthcare is one of the biggest drivers of education costs. Due to the current statewide bargaining process, school employees pay no deductible thanks to the HRAs, right? The health reimbursement arrangement. So layer on top of the VHI plans, this costly benefits are consuming more and more of our local resources every time we go to budget, right? So which forces us to make really tough decisions in cuts in areas that we don't necessarily want to cut. If healthcare costs keeps growing and aren't accounted for in the new format, it could seriously squeeze out critical programming for students. That's why we urge you to take action this session to reform the law governing how school employee health benefits are bargained statewide. This is for the next round of bargaining begins in the spring of 2026 and will shape the benefits to 2030. If you want to make meaningful input on this issue, now is the time. We're also submitting a 2-page document outlining the steps the legislature can take to revise this law and a way to support students and schools in a sustainable budget. In conclusion, H 454 offers a chance to move our education system forward, but only if we proceed with care, compassion, and clarity. We urge you to slow down just enough to get this right. Let's make sure that all voices are heard, especially those from our smallest and most rural communities. Let's make all these decisions on data, research, and what truly helps students. Most importantly, let's continue to invest in public education at the cornerstone of our democracy, one that is inclusive, equitable, and resilient for generations to come. So thank you for your time and for your commitment to all the students in Vermont. If you have questions.
I guess the balance that we're looking at, the governor wants this to move more quickly than this bill. We put $100 million into buying down tax rates last year, and they were unacceptably high. The governor has promised put 77 to $100 million in this year to buy down the average 5% on top of that 14 last year. We're not sure we're going to be able to hold on to the 77 million that's in the yield bill this year. And every year we delay, and I'm still not clear how this is going to save money in the short run. But there's that balance. We're not sure how long we can keep putting $100 million a year or more in to buying down the tax rate. And at some point, it's already bad out there for you. It's going to get worse if we can't. So there's a real push to get it right, but the finances are not good for anyone at this point. And that's leaving out what the feds might do to us.
I think budgets passed this year, right? I think people understand and support public education in the States. That we were able to turn that narrative around. I think what's important is that you take your time to get it right, right? You can't get it wrong, right? You can't get it wrong for students. So, and the other thing is that this bill doesn't really address the cost drivers. Right, so unless you're really addressing the cost drivers, so yes, there is going to be some savings depending on how that consolidation. And I'm not the expert in cost.
We're still trying to figure
So, but you don't have enough modeling to really show how that is going to become.
still trying to get the governor's modeling.
So I
So far,
think
we
that
don't
you have to, you have to dance through this storm, but you have to dance in a way that you are at every step of the time getting the people that are expert in testifying and shaping the bill, considering what is best for students, right? What is best for future citizens of Vermont. So I think if you stay student-centered and do it with that vision, then whatever costs that you're hoping to get won't be just draconian cost cuts. It would be based on the evidence and what we want for kids. You know, we already sort of bypassed the Commission of Public Education in some ways by presenting this bill to the legislature instead of to our commission, but here's where we are. So let's be solution oriented, make sure that we're at every step, you're doing that with data that's solid, not just rushing the process because we're afraid of what the governor is going to do. You know, like we have a responsibility to all of the citizens in Vermont and public education. I don't know how many times I can say it's a foundation of democracy, so can we take it lightly? So it's not. Senator Brewer.
I would ask everyone in this committee to do some research on the demographic trends for Vermont because they are tricky to say the least. So I think trying to thread the needle between being student focused and being affordable for the average Vermonter, I think it's going to be really hard.
It is.
And I agree that I don't think we should rush into it. Flora, I'm really thankful that you have in your testimony a piece about the bargaining process because we haven't really talked about that much. And I always feel like it's kind of the elephant in the room. Are you particularly pointing to healthcare bargaining in your testimony? Okay.
Yeah.
So to put a fine point on it, do you think it should be brought back down to the district to be able to? No.
There's a composition that the way the bargaining committee right now works is 5 and 5, right?
Yeah.
It just never, it always goes to arbitration.
Yeah.
So, and if you're going to leave it like that, at least the arbitration part, please make it so that when he comes out, he's able to take things from both sides, right? And be more of an interest-based decision at the end. So it's not just what the teachers want or what the lawyers want, like it is a combination of what is best.
Okay.
It was nice when districts have that bargaining chip, to be honest. It was something.
Yeah, but I think that if you look at it, it takes a lot of time. Healthcare is really a human right? So we shouldn't be bargaining on,
Right.
But at the same time, it's a cost driver, right? So if you do it you want to be pay teachers what they're worth, and you wanna be paying them not just on healthcare, you wanna be paying them on salary, and I don't know, it's a fine line I'm looking at two, but it's a really, it's a cost driver. It's a cost driver. by half.
It is, it's a cost driver, and I mean, salaries and benefits are a huge part of all of this, and it's also a time consuming process every year or 2 years, as someone who's on a board, it's a lot.
And you don't
we're
have
not-
experts
we're
at the table.
We're not expert negotiators. so
Yeah,
it's
and
tricky.
it sort of depends of who's sitting at the table, is
Yeah.
rotating all the time. It's just not fair. It's not fair to taxpayers.
Right.
Not fair to teachers.
Yeah.
At least being statewide, it's better.
Yeah,
I think I'm looking both Chelsea and
but I also.
so we don't, by all means, I'm not saying bring it back to the boards. We do not want it back to the boards.
Okay,
I'm also not sure it's fair to have one contract for the whole state. I'm not sure I'm a proponent for that either. I'm just saying, I hope that this bill can contemplate some kind of process or structure for all of that, because it is a big part of the costs.
Yeah, and right now, what we're asking is just two very small things that
Yes.
could be done in this.
Yeah.
In
Okay.
this session.
they're too small, but we're fixing healthcare, not to worry. Warning, we're fixing it.
We are.
Yeah.
We get there.
I think actually we are gonna make a little progress.
I
I don't,
think
it
so
won't
too.
kick in this year.
But I'm looking at your proposal on healthcare, and I've seen this before, and I think the two things you're asking for are, one, to allow the arbitrator to create an award based on mixing and matching the two sides, basically. And I was on the education committee when we did this originally, and we had a lot of conversations about how we should do this. And ended up saying you have to pick one or the other. And both times they've had to pick, the arbitrator picked one or the other and picked the teacher's side, and it was the more expensive side. So I do think it is part of what's driving the cost of healthcare, unfortunately. But the other thing, so I think we might want to think about that a little bit, but the other thing you're is having costs be part of the factor in arbitration. Is that you said you had two small things? Those are the two.
Yeah,
things?
but right now, the smallest thing is the composition of the board, right? You have 5 and 5.
Oh, the composition.
Yeah, yeah. So
Is that in the? That's not in the numbered list.
it's not even a numbered list.
Okay.
I can help.
It is. It's number
on
4.
four.
Change the
Yeah,
composition
of the board. Yeah.
to include neutral members. So you're saying it's 5 and 5. Add another member who's neither a school board
Yeah,
president
because
or a
it,
teacher.
because they would change that balance, right?
All right, objective bystander.
Okay.
It's really real. You know what I mean? It's, and you spend a lot of time on this. So it's a
Yeah.
small, we now have some data. I'm all about doing things with, as an architect, because everything is kind of the process of design, and some of you are familiar with that. So you had this problem of this question several years ago. Now it's been in the field for a while, but asked some questions to get some input back, like let's rebuild the model a little bit with the input. And, it's not linear, it's a real process. So we're back here. We know that it's not working, right? It's always picking just one side.
And what is going on right now? I think I've heard from, I can't remember who, that both sides have agreed to extend the current
Yes.
contract for another year in order to avoid trying to negotiate it during our doing the bill.
Yes.
So what will that mean? How long will that contract go?
It will start again in 2026, the negotiation, right?
The negotiation will start in 26.
2026.
Yeah, it's Susan Glasney, Executive Director for Vermont School Boards Association. So the collecting of the data will start this fall, and then the negotiations have to start by April 1st of 2026.
It
And
was
that will
supposed
be
to have started this April?
last April.
Last April.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so they'll start in April of 2026. That will be for a plan that begins on January 1st, 2028. And they have to have at least they have to agree, or the arbitrator has to, impose, at least a 2-year plan. So we're talking about, it's gonna go at least through 2030, once they start next.
Got it, okay.
I definitely agree that it's worth reconsidering the healthcare contract best offer between the two. One concern I have is I'm guessing they they landed on that where we are now, is that it would motivate both sides to get as close to where they could finally be as possible. And if we allow the deciding body to take a mix, wouldn't that motivate both sides to just go for the gusto, so to speak, and just go at the extreme of what they absolutely want to make?
That was the argument. That was the argument for why we said you have to pick one or the other so that both sides come to something that's reasonable, because they know it might go to the other side. But it hasn't. Well, I don't know. I mean, it depends on who you ask. I mean, what it hasn't done is control costs.
Yeah.
What it has done is gotten really, really, really good healthcare for teachers. And I don't think that's something to sneeze at. That's important, but it's also a really expensive plan. And I don't know if it's just because of that. I mean, I think it depends on who you're talking to. So I don't know if we want to change that or not. When we originally voted on it, I think we were convinced that having one or the other was probably the best way to go, because that would force both sides to come to a reasonable position. But I don't know if it's worked or not. It's
Definitely support
Maybe
trying.
the composition would be.
Very smart.
and maybe it's just changing the
Take the
composition.
one without the other, and so it's an expert in this.
I'm a little bit expert, but
Yeah.
I did want to just provide you with some information from, and I could send you the full decision, the arbitration panel decision from the latest round of bargaining. The last paragraph says, the arbitration panel has considered the statutory factors and reviewed the evidence and testimony in making its final decision. As stated at the outset, the panel's statutory authority is to award either the employer's LBO proposal package or the employee's LBO proposal package. It cannot accept portions of the employer's or employee's packages. Perhaps this arbitration panel would have reached slightly different conclusions than Mr. Cochran, that was the fact finder, as there are clearly no right or wrong answers to these weighty and complicated issues.
Okay.
Let's try it. Let's have them mix it up, get a compromise.
We can.
Okay.
One relatively easy.
I don't know. I mean, if you ask Vanier, they're not happy with that. That's the
No,
option,
I'm
so.
sure we haven't heard from the other side. And basically, we're not going to do anything until we get the cost of health insurance down. And we are working on that, but it is the cost. We're told it is the cost of our largest hospital that is the driving force behind the rates, and we're working on that. But it's probably gonna take a year or two to. We now have a liaison. Or overseer, I'm seeing terms used, watching the numbers coming out. To make sure that everybody understands. So we are trying. I don't think you're gonna see a major impact this year. We've got to get our essentially one health insurer stabilized. But we are all up the creek.
Well, once they cut Medicaid at the federal level, we're all gonna be up the creek
Yeah,
again.
that's, which is why we're not sure we can hold on to the $77 billion to buy down tax rates, because we may have people being hungry along with being homeless in the streets. We don't know at this point.
I think it's a fundamental issue. When we talk about education costs and we talk about healthcare costs, all these costs. And we look at the numbers, Vermont is at the top of the list on all of these areas. And we ourselves have to ask ourselves why. And some of the observations that I've seen over the past years give us a clue. At the beginning of this year, for example, we talked about holding the tax rates down, holding our spending down so that we did not impose high rates of property taxes that were beyond people's ability to pay. And first thing I saw was a meeting in which the Joint Legislative Management Committee, in which we looked at the rates that we were paying people who worked for our legislature, our lawyers and fiscal analysts and so on, and they were getting a rate increase, as I recall, it was just under 7%. And we were looking at an inflation rate, even at that time, of 2.6%. And then we asked ourselves why that happened. Well, it's because what we voted, that's why it happened. And we see that over and over and over again. And until this legislature develops an ability to add discipline to what we do, so that we don't increase costs, so that we don't add to the benefits that we can't afford to pay for, which we do in healthcare quite regularly, as we add bits and pieces because it's a good thing to do. And they're all good things to do, but they're only good things to do if we can afford to pay for it. And that's our problem.
That I have asked why our exchange rates are significantly higher than Maine's, because Maine has a similar demographic. I haven't gotten very far with that on health and welfare, but I think part of it, my hunch is because we have added required, which everybody should have.
Mhm.
I know you and I have tried several times.
And we know, and again, it's not that they're bad things that are being done, they're not.
It's,
But at the same time, we're spending beyond our means. If you want to know how we control the cost, stop spending.
if we can't, if people can't afford it, schools can't afford it. And people can't afford their tax rates, but the tax rates is stopping them from affording healthcare. Then we are just creating a downward spiral, and hopefully we're going to get a handle on it this time, because people do need.
And the other issue is the cost value of time. I know I've spoken about this before. Everybody wants to slow down and do this in a more deliberate way, and that's great, but we've been doing it that way for 20 years. That's why we have 39 different studies of education funding. And now the notion of slow down and do another study is not an acceptable solution.
Well,
It won't get us where we want to go. And in the
We're not
time that
just
we have.
changing the financing, now we're changing the whole system, the governance, everything. I don't think there's a study for that yet.
well, I
We don't
think
There
have
will
to
be.
study.
now,
Correct, we're going.
There will
what
be,
we did is, we did Act 46 and then we backed off. And we did not guide it, we did not continue the study. We knew then that our school's finances were not viable. We knew we were in trouble, but it's very unpopular, as we're finding. And so we backed off. We didn't, we did Act 46, that's it, it's done. And we didn't follow up, and we had an interim Secretary of Education at that point. And then we had COVID. And so we're here, and the financial crisis is worse. And we may make mistakes, but we can't back off, because it's not going to get better.
Well, it's the same thing when we did the Blue Ribbon Tax Commission study to fix the relationship of all of our various tax rates in 2010 and 11. And here we are. We did two of them. We didn't do the third one. We never did it. We never put it all together. And we're back here again. Because all this stuff is related.
Yeah.
Whether it be income taxes, education taxes, and consumption taxes.
Well, we did too.
And when we do one at a time, which we're doing right now, again, it's doomed to failure, because you push it out here, it will pop there. And if we don't holistically look at what we're doing, it's not going to solve the problem. And we know that.
Chair's meeting has been canceled. Senator Beck's gone, he goes. So we have more time. But thank you for, this is getting into committee argument.
I just want to say one last thing.
Yes.
You were saying that you were gonna wait to make any changes until healthcare cost. And the two changes that we were proposing there are to be done now.
Yes, no,
All right, just the ones that you
Yes.
missed.
no, that,
Because if they're not done now, they won't
they
help
will
us
help.
in the sprint.
Yeah, no, we are not going to see a significant reduction by next year.
But those little
So-
updates could help
But
us a
it's
little
coming
bit.
on the horizon.
Okay, thank you so much for your time again.
So we'll wait.
Yeah.
We are finished our list of witnesses. Tomorrow, I've got some space at the end of the day. We're going to go through. But Julia Richter talked about the supplemental spending. And I wanted to do your proposal. Have you got a drafter or?
Yeah.
Okay, so if you get that name to Charlotte, we'll put them on. And we've got John Gray who's going to do a Brigham refresher. I don't know, we tried to get Josh Diamond.
No, what would Josh Diamond?
I'm looking around, he did a lot, I think. Was the person that handled a lot of it in the AG's office. And I'm still trying to find contact for Alan Gilbert. Who was one of the originators of the Brigham decision and has been at all the commission meetings to give public input, and I know he's very concerned about this. So.
What's he concerned about?
But I thought I had his contact information and it's not there. So if he's listening, which he may well be, I'm trying to get him, if anybody knows anyone else that wants to come in to talk about either supplemental spending or Brigham. We will get them on tomorrow. And what are we voting? Oh, we
H 96.
yeah, the one bill we did today, the H 96, increasing monetary threshold for certificates of need. We'll vote that out tomorrow unless somebody pops up and says no. Or you find something that you would like us to do that. But I think that's it.
All right.
We were supposed to be out at 4:30.